What's up, Space Monkeys? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. Today we're going to be reading Blackshirts and Reds, Chapter 8, and I thought it only fitting on our Independence Day, July 4th, today, that we read about the only thing that can actually give us independence, which is, of course, Marxism. So this is going to be fun. This is probably the best chapter in the entire book. I just finished the book this morning. I'm going to try to get the entire chapter out to you today in 2 separate episodes, but we'll see. We're going to start on page 121. And make note here, guys, if you don't know what Marxism is, crash course, it's a critique of capitalism that is entirely non-political. It's economic in nature. And it talks about how, the fruits of the labor being produced should be going to the laborers, and workers in this sense, need to be able to democratically decide where their businesses go, what they produce, how to spend their time, and they should share the wealth. That's what Marxism is. And it's really just a critique of capitalism. Without capitalism, there can be no Marxism. So it's just looking at all of the flaws of capitalism and explaining that. That's Marxism. And of course, Marxism has to be somewhat political nowadays. If you're a Marxist, you have to be somewhat political, I think, if you actually want to get these things done. So that's where I come in as sort of a Leninist as well. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. So this is going to kind of explain that to you. You'll get an idea, but that's kind of what Marxism is. Most people that watch my channel are some form of Marxists. So anyway, this is called The End of Marxism, Chapter 8. Some people say Marxism is a science, and others say it is a dogma, a bundle of reductionist, unscientific claims. I would suggest that Marxism is not a science in the positive sense, formulating hypotheses and testing for predictability, but more accurately a social science, one that shows us how to conceptualize systematically and systemically, moving from surface appearances to deeper, broader features, so better to understand both the specific and the general, and the relationship between the two. Marxism has an explanatory power that is superior to mainstream bourgeois social science, because it deals with the imperatives of class power and political economy. The motor forces of society and history. The class basis of political economy is not a subject for which mainstream social science has much understanding or tolerance. In 1915, Lenin wrote that bourgeois science will not ever hear of Marxism, declaring that it has been refuted and annihilated. Marx is attacked with equal zest by young scholars who are making a career by refuting socialism, and by decrepit elders who are preserving the tradition of all kinds of outworn systems. Over 80 years later, the careerist scholars are still declaring Marxism to have been proven wrong once and for all. As the anti-communist liberal writer Irving Howe put it, quote, "The simplistic formula of textbooks, including the Marxist ones, no longer hold. That is why some of us don't regard ourselves as Marxists." Here I want to argue that Marxism is not outmoded or simplistic, only the image of it entertained by anti-Marxists like Howe. And this is why you'll never see these boutique lefties that do the news, who are basically they call themselves lefties, but they're not fighting the class war, they're fighting the culture war, like Sam Cedar, Kyle Kulinski, Crystal Ball. You'll never see them come out and say, I'm a Marxist and I want to fight the class war. You'll see them focusing on culture issues, which they're social democrats who really just want to tweak around the edges of capitalism. They don't want to get rid of exploitation. They don't want to get rid of capitalism because capitalism has made them all very rich. Some durable basics. With the overthrow of communist governments in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, announcements about the moribund nature of Marxist dogma poured forth with renewed vigor. But Marx's major work was Capital, a study not of existing socialism, which actually did not exist in his day, but of capitalism, a subject that remains terribly relevant to our lives. It would make more sense to declare Marxism obsolete if and when capitalism is abolished, rather than socialism. I wish to argue not merely that Marx is still relevant, but that he is more relevant today than he was in the 19th century, that the forces of capitalist motion and development are operating with greater scope than when he first studied them. Exactly right. This is not to say that everything Marx and Engels anticipated has come true. Their work was not a perfect prophecy, but an imperfect, incomplete science, like all sciences, directed towards understanding a capitalism that leaves its bloody footprints upon the world as never before. Some of Marxism's basic postulates are as follows. In order to live, human beings must produce. People cannot live by bread alone, but neither can they live without bread. This does not mean all human activity can be reduced to material motives, but that all activity is linked to a material base. A work of art may have no direct economic motive attached to it, yet its creation would be impossible if there did not exist the material conditions that allowed the artist to create and show the work to interested audiences who have the time for art. What people need for survival is found in nature, but rarely in a form suitable for immediate consumption. Labor, therefore, becomes a primary condition of human existence. But labor is more than a way of providing for survival. It is one of the means whereby people develop their material and cultural life, acquiring knowledge and new modes of social organization. The conflicting class interests that evolve around the productive forces shape the development of a social system. When we speak of early horticultural societies, or of slave or feudal or mercantile or industrial capitalist societies, we are recognizing how the basic economic relations leave a defining stamp on a given social order. Capitalist theorists present capital as a creative providential force. As they would have it, capital gives shape and opportunity to labor. Capital creates production, jobs, and new technologies, and a general prosperity. Marxists turn the equation around. They argue that itself, capital, cannot produce anything. It is the thing that is produced by labor. Only human labor can create the farm and the factory, the machine and the computer. And in a class society, the wealth so produced by many is accumulated to the hands of a relatively few, who soon translate their economic power into political and cultural power in order to better secure the exploitative social order that favors them so. The standard quote-unquote trickle-down theory says that the accumulation of wealth at the top eventually brings more prosperity to the rest of us below. A rising tide lifts all boats. I would argue that in a class society, the accumulation of wealth fosters the spread of poverty. The wealthy few live off the backs of the impoverished many. There can be no rich slaveholders living in an idle comfort without a mass of penniless slaves to support their luxurious lifestyle. No lords of the manor who live in opulence without a mass of impoverished landless serfs who till the lord's lands from dawn till dusk. So too, under capitalism, there can be no financial moguls and industrial tycoons without millions of underpaid and overworked employees. Exploitation can be measured not only in paltry wages, but in the disparity between the wealth created by the worker and the pay he or she receives. Thus, some professional athletes receive dramatically higher salaries than most people, but compared to the enormous wealth they produce for their owners, and taking into account the rigors and relative brevity of their careers, the injuries sustained, and the lack of lifelong benefits, it can be said they are exploited at a far higher rate than most workers. Conservative ideologues defend capitalism as the system that preserves culture, traditional values, the family, and community. Marxists would respond with that capitalism has done more to undermine such things than any other system in the history of man, given its wars, colonizations, and forced migrations, its enclosures, evictions, poverty wages, child labor, homelessness, underemployment, crime, drug infestation, and urban squalor. All over the world, community in the broader sense, the Gemeinschaft, with its organic social relationships and strong reciprocal bonds of commonality and kinship, is forcibly transformed by global capital into commercialized, atomized, mass-market societies. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels referred to capitalism's implacable drive to settle, quote, over the whole surface of the globe, creating a world after its own image. No system in history has been more relentless in battering down ancient and fragile cultures, pulverizing centuries-old practices in a matter of years, devouring the resources of whole regions, and standardizing the varieties of human experience. Big capital has no commitment to anything but capital accumulation, no loyalty to any nation, culture, or people. It moves inexorably according to its inner imperative to accumulate at the highest possible rate without concern for human and environmental cost. The first law of the market is to make the largest possible profit from other people's labor. Private profitability rather than human need is the determining condition of private investment. There prevails a rational systemization of human endeavor in pursuit of a socially irrational end, quote, accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. More right than wrong. Those who reject Marx frequently contend that his predictions about proletariat revolution have been proven wrong. From this, they conclude that his analysis of the nature of capitalism and imperialism must also be wrong, but we should distinguish between Marx and the Ch8 thinker who made grandly optimistic predictions about the flowering of human conditions, and Marx the economist and social scientist who provided us with fundamental insights into capitalist society that have held painfully true to the present day. The latter Marx has been regularly misrepresented by anti-Marxist writers. Consider the following predictions. Business cycles and the tendency towards recession. Marx noted that something more than greed is involved in the capitalist's relentless pursuit of profit. Given the pressures of competition and rising wages, capitalists must make technological innovations to increase their productivity and diminish their labor costs. This creates problems of its own. The more capital goods, such as machinery, plants, technologies, fuel, needed for production, the higher the fixed costs and the greater the pressure to increase productivity to maintain profit margins. Since workers are not paid enough to buy back the goods and services they produce, Marx noted, there's always the problem of a disparity between mass production and aggregate demand. If demand slackens, owners cut back on production and investment. Even when there is ample demand, they are tempted to downsize the workforce and intensify the rate of exploitation of the remaining employees, seizing any opportunity to reduce benefits and wages. The ensuing drop in the workforce's buying power leads to a further decline in demand and to business recessions that inflict the greatest pain on those with the least assets. Marx foresaw this tendency for profits to fall and for protracted recessions and economic instability. As the economist Robert Heilbronner noted, this was an extraordinary prediction, for in Marx's day, economists did not recognize boom-bust business cycles as inherent to the capitalist system. But today, we know that recessions are a chronic condition and, as Marx also predicted, they have become international in scope. Capital concentration. When the Communist Manifesto first appeared in 1848, bigness was the exception rather than the norm. Yet Marx predicted that large firms would force out or buy up smaller adversaries and increasingly dominate the business world as capital became more concentrated. This was not accepted wisdom of that day and must have sounded improbable to those who gave it any attention. But it has come to pass. Indeed, the rate of mergers and takeovers has been higher in the 1980s and 90s than any other time in the history of capitalism. And remember, this book came out in 97. It's way out of control compared to 97 today. Growth of the proletariat. Another of Marx's predictions is that the proletariat, which are workers who have no tools of their own and must work for wages and salaries, selling their labor to someone else, would become an even greater percentage of the workforce. In 1820, about 75% of Americans worked for themselves on farms or in small businesses and artisan crafts. By 1940, that number had dropped to 21.6%. Today, less than 10% of the labor force is self-employed. The same shift in the workforce can be observed in the Third World. From 1970 to 1980, the number of wage workers in Asia and Africa increased to almost two-thirds, from 72 million to 120 million. The tendency is toward the steady growth of the working class, both industrial and service workers, and, as Marx predicted, this is happening globally, in every land upon which capitalism descends. Proletarian revolution. As capitalism develops, so will the proletariat, Marx predicted. We have seen that to be true. But he went further. With the growing misery and polarization, the masses would eventually rise up and overthrow the bourgeoisie and put the means of production under public ownership for the benefit of all. The revolution would come in the more industrialized capitalist countries that had large, developed working classes. Hasn't happened yet. Yet. What struck Marx about the working class was its level of organization and consciousness. Unlike previously oppressed classes, the proletariat, heavily concentrated in urban areas, seemed capable of an unparalleled level of political development. And it was Mao that thought that that's where the revolution would start, is with farmers, which that might be true. That we'll have to see. It would not only rebel against its oppressors, as had slaves and serfs, but would create an egalitarian, non-exploitative social order as never before seen in history. In his day, Marx saw an alternative system emerging in the clubs, mutual aid societies, political organizations, and newspapers of a rapidly growing British working class. For the first time, history would be made by the masses in a conscious way, a class for itself. Sporadic rebellion would be replaced by class consciousness revolution. Instead of burning down the manor, the workers would expropriate it and put it to use for the collective benefit of the common people, the ones who built it in the first place. Certainly Marx's predictions about revolution have not materialized. There has been no successful proletariat revolution in an advanced capitalist society. As the working class developed, so did the capitalist state, whose function has been to protect the capitalist class, with its mechanisms of police suppression and its informational and cultural hegemony. Of itself, class struggle does not bring inevitable proletarian victory or even a proletarian uprising. Oppressive social conditions may cry out for revolution, but that does not mean revolution is forthcoming. This point is still not understood by some present-day leftists. In his later years, Marx himself began to entertain doubts about the inevitability of a victorious workers' revolution. So far, the prevailing force has not been revolution, but counter-revolution, the devilish destruction wreaked by capitalist states upon popular struggles at a cost of millions of lives. And that's why it's so difficult, because it's not just enough to start up revolution. You have to understand that capitalism fights back against revolution with everything it has, and it has all the capital. So we have to figure out ways to do this as poor people by gaining steam together, by working together. And that's what I'm trying to do with getting a bunch of content creators together that do the INN stuff, the Indie News Network, and then their own shows. That's a news network that is of and for the people. That's Marxism online doing the news. And we have to do that in every aspect of our lives if we want to have a fighting chance. Marx also underestimated the extent to which the advanced capitalist state could use its wealth and power to create a variety of institutions that retard the distract popular consciousness or blunt discontent through reform programs. And now Taylor Lorenz is going to come after me because I used the R word. I'm going to read that again. Marx also underestimated the extent to which the advanced capitalist state could use its wealth and power to create a variety of institutions that retard the distract popular consciousness or blunt discontent through reform programs. Contrary to his expectations, successful revolutions occurred in less developed, largely peasant societies such as Russia, China, Cuba, Vietnam, though the proletariats in those countries participated and sometimes, as in the case of Russia in 1917, even spearheaded the insurgency. Although Marx's predictions about revolution have not materialized as he envisioned, in recent years there have been impressive instances of working-class militancy in South Korea, South Africa, Argentina, Italy, France, Germany, Great Britain, and dozens of other countries, including even the United States. Such mass struggles usually go unreported in the corporate media. In 1984 to 85, in Great Britain, a bitter year-long strike resulted in some 10,500 coal miners being arrested, 6,500 injured or battered, and 11 killed. For the British miners locked in that conflict, class struggle was something more than a quaint, obsolete concept. In other countries, in Nicaragua, a mass uprising brought down the hated Somoza dictatorship. In Brazil, from 80 to 83, as Peter Worsley observed, quote, "The Brazilian working class has played precisely a role assigned to it in the 19th century Marxist theory, paralyzing Sao Paulo in a succession of enormous mass strikes that began over bread-and-butter issues, but which in the end forced the military to make major political concessions, notably the restoration of a measure of authentic party political life. Revolutions are relatively rare occurrences, but popular struggle is a widespread and constant phenomenon." And I think we will end right there. We'll do the second half today Actually, let's do one more. Well, it's a long chapter, so I'm going to do two episodes today. More wealth, more poverty. Marx believed that as wealth becomes more concentrated, poverty will become more widespread, and the plight of working people ever more desperate. According to his critics, this prediction has proven wrong. They point out that he wrote during a time of raw industrialism, an era of robber barons and 14-hour workdays. Through persistent struggle, the working class improved its life conditions from the mid-19th to the mid-20th centuries. Today, mainstream spokespersons portray the U.S. as a prosperous middle-class society, which we know it is not. Yet one might wonder, during the Reagan-Bush-Clinton era from 1981 to 1996, the share of the national income that went to those who work for a living shrank by 12%. The share that went to those who live off investments increased about 35%. Less than 1% of the population owns almost 50% of the nation's wealth. The richest families are hundreds of times wealthier than the average household in the lower 90% of the population. The gap between America's rich and poor is greater than it has been in more than a half century and is getting ever greater. And remember, this book was written, 25 years ago. Thus, between 1977 and 89, the top 1% saw their earnings grow by over 100%, while the three lowest quintiles averaged 3 to 10% drop in real income. The New York Times in 96 reported that income disparity in 1995, quote, was wider than it has been since the end of World War II. The average income for the top 20% jumped 44%, from $73,754 to $105,945 between 68 and 94, while the bottom 20% had a 7% increase from $7,200 to $7,700. Or only about $500 in 500 constant dollars. But these figures understate the problem. The Times story is based on a Census Bureau study that fails to report the income of the very rich. Of course they did. For years, the reportable upper limit was $300,000 yearly income. In 1994, the Bureau lifted the allowable limit to $1 million, but this still leaves out the richest 1%, the hundreds of billionaires and thousands of multimillionaires who make many times more than $1 million a year. The really big money is concentrated in a portion of the population so minuscule as to be judged statistically insignificant. But despite their tiny numbers, the amount of wealth they control is enormous and bespeaks an income disparity 1,000 times greater than the spread allowed by the Census Bureau figures. Thus, the difference between a multi-billionaire who might make $100 million in any year and a janitor who makes $8,000 is not 14 to 1, but 14,000 to 1. Yet the highest incomes remain unreported and uncounted. In a word, most studies of this sort give us no idea of how rich the very rich really are. The number living below the poverty level in the United States climbed from 24 million in 77 to over 35 million in 95. People were falling more deeply into poverty than in earlier times and finding it increasingly difficult to emerge. In addition, various diseases related to hunger and poverty have been on the rise. There has been a general downgrading of the workforce. Regular employment is being replaced by contracted labor or temporary help, resulting in lower wages with fewer or no benefits. Many unions have been destroyed or seriously weakened. Protective government regulations are being rolled back or left unenforced, and there has been an increase in speed-ups, injuries, and other workplace abuses. By the 1990s, the growing impoverishment of the middle and working classes, including small independent workers, was becoming evident in various countries. In 20 years, more than half of the farmers in industrialized countries, some 22 million, were ruined. Meanwhile, as noted in the previous two chapters, free market reforms have brought a dramatic increase in poverty, hunger, crime, and ill health, along with the growth of large fortunes for the very few in the former communist countries. The Third World has endured deepening impoverishment over the last half century. As foreign investment has increased, so has the misery of the common people who are driven from the land. Those who manage to find employment in the cities are forced to labor for subsistence wages. We might recall how enclosure acts of the late 18th century in England fenced off common lands and drove the peasantry into the industrial hellholes of Manchester and London, transforming them into beggars or half-starved factory workers. Enclosure continues throughout the Third World, displacing tens of millions of people. In countries like Argentina, Venezuela, or Peru, per capita income was lower in 1990 than it had been in 20 years earlier. In Mexico, workers earned 50% less in 95 than in 1980. One-third of Latin America's population, some 130 million, live in utter destitution, while tens of millions more barely manage. In Brazil, the purchasing power of the lower income brackets declined by 50% between 1940 and 1990, and at least half the population suffered varying degrees of malnutrition. And if you notice, a lot of those, came out in 97, a lot of these countries like Brazil, Venezuela, Mexico, either are about to elect a socialist or have recently elected a socialist, because they get ravaged for only so long, and then eventually some sort of either a political revolution happens or an actual revolution happens, and it seems like they've actually elected some socialist leaders in response to these conditions. Again, it's been 25 years since this book came out, so maybe the US is 20 years away from electing somebody like Bernie Sanders, but it's going to be a rough 20 years if that's the case. In much of Africa, misery and hunger have assumed horrendous proportions. In Zaire, 80% of the people live in absolute penury. In Asia and Africa, more than 40% of the population linger at the starvation level. Marx predicted that an expanding capitalism would bring greater wealth for the few and growing misery for the many. That seems to be what is happening, and on a global scale. So now we're on page 132. I will finish up the rest of the chapter later today. Sorry that was a little long. It's a long chapter, but I hope you enjoyed that. Keep fighting that good fight out there, guys. I'll talk to you later.